Just before midnight, on a warm July night in Bristol, a witness sees something deeply unsettling. A man is standing near one of Britain's most famous bridges. But he isn't alone. He's carrying suitcases, heavy ones, and there's something about his behavior that doesn't feel right. The witness calls the police. Within minutes, officers are on their way. But by the time they arrive, the man has disappeared. There is no suspect, no explanation, only the suitcases. Then police discover what is inside: human remains. Suddenly, a strange late-night sighting becomes a murder investigation. The iconic Clifton suspension bridge is closed. Police flood the area. Forensic investigators begin searching for evidence, and a manhunt begins for the stranger who vanished into the night. But what investigators don't know yet is that those suitcases are only one part of a much larger and far more disturbing story. Because the victims didn't die on the bridge, their deaths began inside a London apartment. And as detectives reconstruct the final days of two men, they uncover a complicated world of relationships, money, sex, deception and violence. This is the story of the Bristol suitcase murders, and this is how police went from a mysterious discovery on a bridge to a killer standing trial. It was Wednesday, July 10th, 2024. Bristol was quiet as the night settled over the city. The Clifton suspension bridge stretched across the Avon Gorge, one of the city's most recognizable landmarks. During the day, it attracts tourists, pedestrians, and traffic. But late at night, the atmosphere is very different. And shortly before midnight, something unusual caught the attention of a member of the public. A man was seen behaving suspiciously near the bridge. He appeared to be struggling with heavy suitcases. There was enough concern that police were called. The information reaching officers was alarming. A man, heavy luggage, suspicious behavior, and indications that something might be seriously wrong. Police were dispatched. They arrived only minutes later. But the man had vanished. What he left behind was far more disturbing. The suitcases were examined, and investigators made a horrifying discovery. They contained human remains. At that moment, the entire nature of the investigation changed. This wasn't suspicious behavior anymore. This was murder. Clifton suspension bridge was closed. A crime scene was established. Forensic investigators began examining the area. Police searched the surrounding woodland and paths. Every detail mattered. Where had the suspect come from? Where had he gone? Had he been alone? And most importantly, who were the victims? The investigation immediately became a race against time. The suspect had escaped, but he had made one critical mistake. He had been seen. Witnesses could provide descriptions. CCTV could potentially reveal his movements. And the suitcases themselves could contain evidence. Investigators began retracing the suspect's journey. One of the most important discoveries came from the taxi that had transported the man. Police were able to trace the vehicle and begin reconstructing the journey. The question was no longer simply, who left these suitcases? It became, where did they come from? As investigators followed the evidence, the trail moved away from Bristol. It led toward London. Specifically, to an apartment in Shepherd's Bush, and inside that property, investigators found evidence that suggested the suitcase discovery was only the beginning. More human remains were discovered. The horrifying reality began to emerge. There were not one, but two victims. They were eventually identified as Alfonso, age 62, and Paul Longworth, age 71. The two men were partners, and detectives now had to reconstruct what had happened inside their home. Who had been there? When had the murders occurred? And why had the bodies been transported to Bristol? The two men were in a civil partnership and shared a home in London. To investigators, understanding their lives was crucial. Because victims are often the key to understanding a murder. Their relationships, their finances, their communications, their routines. The people who had recently visited them, and the people who might have had a reason to hurt them. Detectives began examining phones, messages, computers, CCTV and other evidence. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the final period of the men's lives. And one name kept coming into focus. Yastin Andres Mosquera, a Colombian national. A man who had connections to the victims. And a man who, according to the investigation, had been in the London apartment. Suddenly, Police had something they didn't have when they first arrived at Clifton Bridge. A possible suspect, Mosquera had traveled from London toward Bristol. And according to the prosecution's case, he was connected directly to the deaths of Alfonso and Longworth. The evidence led investigators to Bristol. And on July 13th, just days after the discovery of the suitcases, Mosquera was arrested. The manhunt was over, but the investigation was far from finished. Police now had to answer the most important question of all: what exactly had happened inside the London apartment? As investigators examined the relationship between Mosquera and the victims, the case became increasingly complicated. This was not a random attack. The people involved knew one another. There were relationships involving sex, money and trust. And according to evidence later presented in court, Mosquera had spent time with the victims. The prosecution would argue that the relationship eventually turned violent. The circumstances surrounding the deaths were deeply disturbing. The victims had been killed, their bodies had been dismembered, and parts of their remains were placed into suitcases. Those suitcases were then transported from London toward Bristol. The suspect was eventually found. He was arrested, he was prosecuted, and he was convicted. So this wasn't an unsolved mystery after all. It was something perhaps even more disturbing, a murder case whose first clue was left sitting in plain sight on a famous bridge. Two suitcases, two victims, one terrifying journey, and a witness whose decision to make one phone call helped unravel the entire case. Because sometimes, the smallest detail in a crime is the one that brings everything to light. The Bristol Suitcase Murders, July 2024. If you found this case compelling, subscribe for more carefully researched true crime stories.